So
well, Hamas was elected in Gaza. I mean, Hamas in the election in Israel, in Palestine about 2 years ago, Hamas won the election, but Fatah would not recognize them. And so there is this division in the Palestinian community between Fatah and Hamas, and until there is some reconciliation and solution to that problem, the Palestinians will be weak. And the Americans work with Fatah and the Egyptians work with Fatah, and their real objective is to deal with Hamas. I think it's really the Americans are the people who have the power to deal with this because they fund Israel. And if the American government were to say to Israel, stop the settlements, recognize Hamas and Fatah and encourage them to come together. And I think in that case, the Israelis would be forced to do that. And America is the only country that's in a position to do it because of the enormous amount of money they put into Israel every year, which Israel depends on. Human rights have to be won by every country in their own country. You can't make a war for human rights in somebody else's country. If you take apartheid in South Africa, it was won by Mandela and the African National Congress. And the British government was very hostile to Mandela, but Mandela won. If we had invaded South Africa to bring human rights in South Africa, there would have been bloodshed and disaster. So I don't accept the argument that you go into a country in order to improve conditions for the people there. They have to do it themselves. And the United Nations Charter, which I support and which we set up after the war, they said you cannot attack another country unless you yourself are attacked or unless the United Nations itself says there is a threat to peace. And the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan were not legal, they were illegal, and they were a breach of the United Nations. So I mean, Winston Churchill once said, jaw talking is better than war killing. And you have to talk to people and understand what the conflict is. And I think the Afghan war is a disaster too. It cannot be won because the people of Afghanistan say, why is our country occupied by the Americans and the British and NATO? Why? And they fight for independence, as we would do if we were occupied. So I think the main thing is to understand what's happening. If you do understand, then you're more likely to make sense. If you don't understand, then it just is a matter of the enemy and the war on terror.
but all this,
You see, that was a lie.
yeah,
They said that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He did not have weapons of mass destruction. What happened in Iraq was very simple. Bush decided, before 9/11, before the attack on New York, in January 2000, when he was elected president, at the first cabinet meeting that Bush had, on the agenda of the American cabinet was the regime change in Iraq to get rid of Saddam. And from then right until the war, Bush was absolutely determined to destroy Saddam and impose a government sympathetic to America. And Blair, the British Prime Minister, decided that whatever Bush did, he would go along with it. And so we became partners, and we were told lies by Blair. Blair said that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and he didn't. And when the troops went in, they didn't find any weapons, so that's true. And now they talk about Iran becoming a nuclear power. Now I tell you something, when I was Secretary of State for Industry, for Energy in 1977, I went to Tehran, and I had 3 hours with the Shah in Tehran. And at that time, the policy of the American government was to persuade the Shah to adopt nuclear power. American policy was trying to persuade Iran to have nuclear power. And that was because the Shah was there, and the Shah was an American agent running Iraq. Running Iran at that time. So you see, a little bit of history helps you to understand these things.
it's like Bin Laden they use, and then
They used Bin Laden to help to get the Russians out of Afghanistan, yeah. Well, I think the question of the burqa has to be decided by each society itself. I mean, we talk about women's rights, but Britain is not so wonderful about women's rights. I mean, when my mother was born in 1897, women didn't have the vote. And there was a big battle against women ministers in the Church of England, and now there's still opposition to women bishops. And then we lecture the rest of the Muslim world on how their conduct towards women. Well, I've no doubt there's progress to be made, but it's got to be made in those countries by those people fighting for their own rights. And if you do that, of course, when it happens, it will survive. The reforms will continue. But if you try and impose it by war, then you build up resistance. Well, no, the stories I hear about 9/11 was that it was all arranged by the Americans, not by Mossad. And I don't really believe those stories. I find it inconceivable that President Bush could have blown up the Twin Towers in order to justify a war. I think there's something wrong about it. But I've read the arguments, I've seen the videos, I understand them very, very well. But for my part, I do not believe that story, although there are some very puzzling things about 9/11 which have to be explained, about the buildings collapsing and so on. But I don't believe in conspiracy theories, although there are conspiracies, of course, from time to time.
Thank you, Mr. Benn.
Okay.